Hi, this is Mrs. Kidman, and in this video, we are going to be discussing angles of rotation. So what is an angle of rotation? Well, an angle of rotation is an angle that's formed by rotating a ray around its endpoint. So when we have one, we usually start with our ray here, which would be right here, and it gets rotated around this endpoint right here. And the amount that we rotate it depends on the degree of the angle that we want. So we might rotate it to here. We might rotate it to here. Or we could even rotate it to here. But it gets rotated in this direction. And notice how all of those angles were rotated counterclockwise. So when it comes to an angle of rotation, we typically rotate it counterclockwise, but we can also rotate it clockwise. Now, the distance that we rotate it is dependent on the degree of the angle that we want to draw. And the degree of the angles matches with this image here. So going from our starting point, if we were to rotate all the way around back to our starting point, that would be 360 degrees. If we were to go halfway, so that would be going all the way around, would be 360. If we only went halfway, that would take us to 180. If we went a quarter of the way, it would take us to 90, while if we went 3/4 of the way, it would take us to 270. Okay, and then any angle measurement in between we can always use as well. So when it comes to these angles of rotation actually have some standard pieces that we care about. We have got the initial ray here, and we like to call it the initial side. And that initial side tells us where we're starting on our angle of rotation. And then what happens is we choose to rotate. And so depending on where we choose to rotate, we're going to end up getting something different. Now, if we rotated here, we can kind of get to this line here two different ways. But this line where our angle stops at is called our terminating side. And the reason why we call it the terminating side, or a way to remember it, is remember, terminate means stop. So this is the side where our angle stops at. And there's two different ways to get there. We can either go counterclockwise, and in this case we would be at about 150 degrees, where we are past, remember this point here is 90, this would be 180, so 150 is right in between those two. Or what we can do is we can actually go counterclockwise, and we actually went 210 degrees counterclockwise. Okay, it doesn't matter which way we go, but when we go counterclockwise, then we usually have a positive angle. If we go clockwise, when it comes to our standard position, those angles are actually negative. So we're actually going a negative 210 that way rather than a positive 150. So if we go counterclockwise, it's positive. If we go clockwise, it's negative. Now, the very last thing we care about is, just like in a regular coordinate grid, when we have these positions of angles, we actually can determine which quadrant they end up in. So this first quadrant here, so between 0 and 90 is considered quadrant 1. Between 90 and 180 is quadrant 2. 180 to 270 is quadrant 3. And 270 to 360, if we were to go all the way back around, is quadrant 4. Okay, so we can use this idea of the standard positions to figure out where our angles are. So what we're going to do is we are just going to practice drawing these angles in standard position and then deciding what quadrant their terminal side is in. So we're going to start by drawing that standard plane that we have here. And what we want to do is we want to start with our initial side, and then we want to go to our terminating side, or that terminal side. Well, one thing I like to do is think about, where are these angles going to be? So here it's at 0, straight up is 90, over here is 180, down at the bottom is 270, and then back here is 360. So if we have something that's 240, it is going to be between 180 and 270. So we're going to put it over here. And what quadrant is that? Well, this is quadrant 1, 2, 3, 4. So it will end up being in quadrant 3. Okay, so we can see, as long as we label those high points, that x-axis and that y-axis, then we can figure out what quadrant it's in. And notice how these quadrants are labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, because our angles of rotation hit those quadrants in that order. it first goes through quadrant 1, then it goes through quadrant 2, then it goes through quadrant 3, then it goes through quadrant 4. So let's take a look at 75 here. We're going to do it the exact same way. So we've got 0, 90, 180, 270, 360. We start with our initial side, and where does our terminating side go? Well, our terminating side is going to be between 0 and 90 because it's at 75. So it'll be over here, and that is quadrant 1. Awesome. So that is how we can do it when they are positive. Now, what happens if it's negative? Well, we talked about if we have a negative angle, instead of going counterclockwise, we're actually going to go clockwise that same amount. And so when it comes to a negative angle, we want to label our chart differently. Instead of labeling it counterclockwise, where we go 0, 90, 180, 270, 360, we want to go the other way. So this is still 0, but this is going to be negative 90, negative 180, negative 270, and then negative 360. And we want to go in that other way. So if we have a negative 210, we're going to start here. And then we want to go to 210, which is going to be between negative 180 and negative 270. So it will be over here. So we can see that we actually rotated this way, unlike in these other two where we were rotating counterclockwise. In this one, we are rotating clockwise. And so we went negative 210 all the way around there. But notice how when we go negative, it's the opposite. It goes quadrant 4, quadrant 3, quadrant 2, quadrant 1. So we actually ended up in quadrant 2 here. So let's take a look at 2 more examples here where we are drawing these angles of rotation where we have negative angles. And then we will move on to talking about coterminal angles in the next video. So in this case, we want to go through and label our axes the way we did before. Because this is a negative angle, we want to label our chart with the negatives. This is going to go 0, negative 90, negative 180, negative 270. Awesome. Then we have our terminal side. We're going to negative 90, which is just right here. And we're going to go this way. Now, what quadrant is this in? Well, this is right between quadrants 3 and quadrant 4. Okay, notice how it's right in between those two. Now we've got one more here, 285. We've got 0, negative 90, negative 180, negative 270, and negative 360. We've got our initial side. And then we are going all the way until we hit 285. Well, this is negative 270. Right here, we've got negative 360, so it's going to be right in between those, but we want to label that we went all the way around to get there. So where did we end up in? We ended up in quadrant 1 at the end there. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out, but that is how we can determine angles of rotation on when we're drawing an angle in standard position. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Our next video, we will be discussing coterminal angles, what they are, and how we can find them.